Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rebecca Higgett. I'm a historian of science at the University of Kent, and it's my pleasure to be chairing the discussion this evening. I'll introduce you to the rest of the panel in a moment. I can say that on behalf of the Royal Society, I'm welcoming you here this evening, and I hope you enjoy this discussion, which is part of the Society's series of events focusing on history of science. So there's something of a strand of those if you want to look out for them. Before we start, I have some housekeeping information to pass on. Please, can you turn off your mobile phones, or at least make sure they don't make any noises suddenly during the proceedings. There is no planned fire alarm, so if one goes off, then it is to be taken seriously. The fire exits are located on your left at the side of the room, which is that side, I think. Please note also that this event will be recorded, but that means it will be available to view on the Royal Society's website after the event. So the title of tonight's discussion is Adventures in the Indo-Pacific. There's information on the screen behind me if you're interested in tweeting, sharing on social media your thoughts and comments and questions on the event. Before we meet the rest of the panelists tonight, I'm just going to set you the scene a little bit, give you some background about why we're having this event today and why we're interested in Joseph Banks, particularly, who is the sort of eminence grise behind today's discussion, but also thinking about his activities and his influence in the shorter and the longer term. It is a long-term story. Even his own career was a long one. He was really important within Britain, within Europe, the world of science, and of course the world beyond, as we'll be talking about. His career lasted around 50 years, and he was the longest serving president of the Royal Society. Presidents don't get to serve many decades anymore, probably a good idea, but Banks certainly dominated this society in the 18th and early 19th century. He came to prominence generally, although he was an individual from a wealthy background, but he came to real prominence in the world of science after he had the opportunity to join the expedition of James Cook's Pacific voyage on the Endeavour, taking him to the South Pacific. And he undertook a large amount of botanizing and ethnographic kinds of studies during that voyage, and his collections of specimens, his stories that he could tell afterwards, his links to what was a very famous and successful voyage, set his role up in life, but also drew people's interest in the world of scientific voyaging that had a long legacy within Britain, but also many other nations as well. So we'll be talking about Banks's influence and impact, his experiences, but also thinking about some of the longer term impacts, thinking also to some contemporary issues in relation to science and society, the global world that we live in. The event is running tonight because it's happening alongside a conference that's been taking place today and tomorrow here at the Royal Society, and then also at Kew on Saturday. I have a nice brochure here. It's called Joseph Banks, Science, Culture and Exploration, 1743 to 1820. That's his dates. And this is the culminating conference from a AHRC, that's Arts and Humanities Research Council funded network on Joseph Banks and the remaking of the Indo-Pacific world. That's a collaboration between a number of institutions. I've lost the list now, but maybe we'll hear more later because we have the lead of that network here with us, Simon Werrett. I'll introduce everyone in a moment. But we have a number of people who've been at that conference. They've heard a lot about Banks today, but they're still here for more, thank you, because he is endlessly fascinating. There are so many things that his life and story can lead us to discuss. So I'm now going to introduce the panelists and then let them each in turn say a little bit more about themselves and their interests in tonight's discussion. We have Dr. Simon Werrett, Senior Lecturer in History and Philosophy of Science at University College London, who has worked widely on European science and its networks, particularly in the 18th century, 17th and 18th centuries. And as I say, he's been one of the coordinators of the AHRC network project, which he'll say a little bit more about. Beyond him, I'm happy to welcome Professor Ian McCalman, Professor of History at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Sydney Environment Institute. He is author of undoubtedly many things, but including The Reef, A Passionate History from Captain Cook to Climate Change. So covering both ends of the spectrum that we'll be discussing this evening. We have Professor Cathy Willis, who's Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, whose work has focused on long-term biodiversity responses to environmental change. But they can contradict me, correct me, say more, if I'd like to pass on to each of you in turn to just give us an opening thoughts.
Thank you, Becky. As Becky says, I'm one of the coordinators, just one, there's actually a team of us, running a project at the moment which is starting to research Banks's life and career in the 18th, early 19th century, and doing that over a year through a series of workshops, not so much to find out answers about Banks, but to just figure out what good questions are to ask. Banks is a character who's involved in so many things, and there are so many aspects to his life. When you start to study him, it's quite hard to know where to begin. So what we're doing is essentially undertaking the start of a research project that just figures out what's worth knowing about Joseph Banks. Now, Banks he's quite famous among historians of science. He's not so famous outside of history of science, not compared to someone like Newton or Darwin, but among historians of science, he's very well known for his voyage on the Endeavour with Captain Cook, and for his work as a botanist in the Pacific. But one of the things that you quickly realise about Banks is that was only a very small part of his life project. And by the mid to late 1770s, it wasn't over for him, but he had many other concerns and many other interests that developed along the way. So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at and exploring further is that later part of Banks's life and the things that he did once he became president of the Royal Society, and in particular, a very interesting part of that story is his house. So he lived in Soho Square in Bloomsbury. The house is not there anymore, unfortunately, but if you go to Soho Square, you can see a building on the other side of the street that looks exactly the same as Banks's house did. But Banks's house at Soho Square was a very interesting place because the front of it was his home. And he lived there with his wife, with his sister, Sophia Banks. But the back part of the house, and it was a huge house because he's very wealthy, so he's got this enormous property. The back part was a library and a museum. And Banks invited all kinds of people to Soho Square to do scientific research, to see the collections that he amassed, to use his library, to use images of plants and plant specimens. And actually, we don't know that much about this place. Because it was a house, it hasn't really been studied as a scientific institution. And yet, it was on a scale and involved a quantity of research that really puts it up with the Royal Society, the Royal Institution, British Museum, as a really important place for science in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So what we're hoping to do in the future is to really try and understand what was going on in Soho Square and how Banks operated there and what went through that place, and then how important it was for the development of botany, of natural history and science in that period. There's loads of other things that we're interested in doing, but I won't go on about those now. But that just gives you a brief idea of the kind of thing that we're interested in understanding Banks and his world.
Thank you.
Right. Well, I bumped into Banks kind of incidentally when persuaded by the BBC to do undertake a reenactment of Cook's voyage through the Great Barrier Reef from Cairns to Indonesia in 2001, and we were simulating what it was like to do it under 18th century conditions. And there was a botanist on board trying to simulate the botany, and I was simulating being an able seaman climbing up the... I don't know. I even simulated the mutineers later by mutiny. It's the Great Laundry Mutiny, 2002. That I also have written a book about from the Great Barrier Reef. I'm much involved in that, which begins with the voyage. It opens with the voyage of Cook and Banks through the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm very interested in that story and in what absolutely flows from that story. I've also written a book about Darwin, Wallace, Huxley, and Hooker, who I see as people who followed in his footsteps. So that I guess my interests are not only Banks, but the legacies that go through Darwin and then on to climate change and other things today.
So I'm Cathy Willis, I'm the Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. And yes, Banks is a very interesting and really influential part of Kew's history, because he was the first, he wasn't the official director, but he was the person that advised George III about the collections that came into Kew. Now, when I've done a lot of sort of reading around Banks and how he built built the sort of Kew empire, if I could use that word. And it's very interesting because one of the first things, obviously, whenever you're thinking, okay, I'm going to think about this talk and the general debate, is just really come through to what collections do we have in Kew from Banks. And of course, Banks's collections are actually in the Natural History Museum. So they went to the British Museum and then they got moved on to the Natural History Museum. But we do have some of his collections, both in the living collection and also in the economic botany collection. So I've brought a couple of things along. For at the end there, do look at them at the end, is, I don't know if we could hold that one up, yep. Actually. The one at the end here, this is Banks's walking stick. It's made out of sugarcane, and it was given to him on a plantation in West Indies, I think. And yeah, I think you can deduce from that who gave it to him and the relationship between that and breadfruit, probably. And in the front here, we have a banksia and we have a mangrove, and I'm not sure what that third thing is, but we also have this palm at the back here, which is the bungalow palm. So this was chopped off one of our palms in the palm house today. We didn't bring the whole thing, as you can see. It was quite an effort to fit that in the car as it was. But all of these are plants that Banks described when he went to Botany Bay and he moved up that coast. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in the last couple of days, just because of this pulling together this group, is we often hear about Banks. We hear about his trip on the Endeavour. We hear about him collecting 3,000 specimens, 1,200 new species to science. But what did the landscape look like? What plants did he see on that landscape, and how has that changed ever since over that time? How has it influenced the European landscape? But more importantly, how has Banks's trip, how has it influenced the Australian landscape? And the things that have come out of that, I would argue, start to make you think a little bit more about Banks as a sort of his environmental motives. Let's put it that way. So certainly, as he collected all these fantastic plants, and we can talk about that as we move through, you start to realise, in fact, that he radically changed the Australian landscape in his vision for what that Australian landscape or the Indo-Pacific landscape should be, the vision of it being a sort of a new Europe, a colony where you introduce millions of sheep, a colony where you start to bring in European crops, and you start to remove all the timber. So therefore you start to, and the soil degradation and the environmental damage that went with those processes was really remarkable. And if you look right now at the biome maps of the world, and you look at the anthropogenic biome, which gives you a really good indication of the sort of imprint on the landscape, you see a very, very strong anthropogenic biome on that that in Indo-Pacific, but particularly in Australia, which started when Banks began to have an interest in Australia, that part of Australia, as a colony.
Do you know that they actually suggested that at one stage there was a serious suggestion Australia should be called Banksia?
Yeah, I can believe it. I can believe it. Yeah.
Simon, perhaps you could say a little bit more about, in Banks this time, what his vision was, in a sense, for how it was we end up with merino sheep being put in Australia and breadfruit taken across. What's the sort of thinking behind that? And does that come out of his voyaging, or is it something that happens once he's in a position of sort of oversight, as it were, of British science as president of the Royal Society?
Well, that's a great question. So I think you have to go back to the 17th and earlier part of the 18th century to answer that. So the first thing to keep in mind is that as far as Europeans are concerned at this time, the world is a gift from God. So it was given to them to use to their benefit. And there's an understanding that you ought to steward, you ought to look after the resources that have been provided by God. But there's a very strong sense that they've been put there for human benefit. So you should make the most of them, you should use them to increase the prosperity of people. People are important. And in the 18th century, natural history, the study of plants and animals, is really tied up with that view. And there's a sense that the world operates on according to a system, according to an order that God designed. And it's possible to intervene in that order in order to make things more prosperous for human beings. So the naturalist who was really influential on Banks was Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish naturalist working in the middle decades of the 18th century. And Linnaeus described what he called the economy of nature. So that, you pronounce it economy of nature, but it has an O at the front, just to make things confusing. The economy of nature is the sort of design plan for the world that God created, in which all species grow and die and decay, and there's cycles of life, if you like. And what Linnaeus thought was that you could take plants and animals from one place to another in order to sort of enhance that. So just as you would take plants and enhance them in your garden, you could do that on a kind of global scale. And Linnaeus came up with really what we see as very way out ideas about transplanting plants from the tropics to his native Sweden and acclimatizing them to the extremely cold conditions of northern Sweden, and then growing them there on plantations in order to feed the Swedish people and to raise their prosperity after they'd had a particularly nasty war and needed some prosperity. And so Linnaeus really pioneered that idea that you could take plants and animals and move them to other parts of the world to cultivate them and then make a profit in some manner from doing that. So it might be commercial, just making money from selling these things. It might be medical, because you could use plants for medicines, and it might be for foodstuffs, all kinds of different reasons. And Banks is, so that's I think the context that Banks is coming out of in his own approach to the natural world. And as he went around the world with Cook, he's looking for opportunities all the time to see if that could be a possibility. So every time they discover new species, the first thing they do with them is they eat them, because that's a way to see if they might be something that could actually turn out to be a really useful foodstuff. So I think he had vulture. This came up today in our conference. So he had grilled vulture in Tierra del Fuego. He ate kangaroo. The first, Banks is famous for encountering kangaroos when they landed in Australia, and pretty quickly they shoot them and they cook them. Because you never know, kangaroo meat might turn out to be a useful commodity. And that was part of this idea that if you did find a species that could be useful, you could take it to where you needed it, acclimatize it, grow it, and then use it to for a profitable end. And that is what the breadfruit is. So the idea was to take the breadfruit to the West Indies, where it could be grown to feed slaves on British plantations. Famously, the first attempt to do that didn't work. That's the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. But they did take them subsequently. So that's the beginning of these translations of species that then have much bigger consequences that we're still experiencing today.
I don't know if you want to take up from that point.
Well, I'll just say something about the turtles, because he forgot actually, and I think both he and Cook forgot that the species that were there didn't actually belong to them, and one of the ways they actually provoked the first real war with Aboriginal people was to take 13 turtles and put them on board their boat. And the Aborigines were somewhat fed up with this idea and visited them and asked for a turtle because it had come from their country. And that was refused because they needed the turtle, they said. And so that provoked a war. It's a bloodshed and eventually a kind of reconciliation. But I think it's kind of significant that that resources, and it's still happening today, resources are what people fight about, and these turtles were absolutely precious because they weighed 300 pounds. A lot of people already had scurvy, and you could take the turtles with them alive on the boat on your way back and eat them as you went. You didn't have fridges in those days. So here you have a kind of struggle, but at the same time they were the staple of the indigenous people. So you get these kind of resource wars.
And I think the resources he was thinking about were not just what he could take back to feed other populations, but also, again, we come back to this whole landscape approach. And I have a quote actually from one of his journals when he first arrived in Botany Bay, which says, "Free from underwood of every kind, and trees were at such great distance from one another that the whole country, or at least a great part of it, might be cultivated without being obliged to cut down a single tree." So he was already thinking, the trees are far apart, we don't have to clear the undergrowth, and therefore it'd be perfect for agriculture. So it's very interesting, that was already on his mind the first time he landed in Botany Bay. But of course, the reason there was no undergrowth on many of those trees, or at least one of the strong possibility, is that it was routinely burnt by the Aborigines. That was part of what they did. So therefore, that landscape was already being managed by the local people.
That's right. They called it fire stick farming.
So there are a lot of collections, objects, things, documents, obviously also printed words left from Banks's time. His legacy includes these collections at the Natural History Museum and elsewhere. And I just wanted each of you to reflect from your sort of different perspectives on what you think is the real significance of those collections today. They're obviously money and time is spent on making sure these things are kept safe for the future. And so I just wonder if you could have some thoughts on collections. There's no Soho Square, unfortunately, but there is a Soho Square. There's no 32 Soho Square as it was in Banks's time, but there are many other things for historians to pore over.
Absolutely. So this project on Joseph Banks is the first time I've worked in the history of natural history. So I started off doing history of physics and astronomy, chemistry. And one of the things I've been very struck by, starting to work with people at the Natural History Museum, is the degree to which these historical artefacts, the things that Banks work with, are still absolutely current in the scientific world. So if you're a botanist, if you work at a biologist, geneticist even today, then it still matters to know about the plants and specimens that were collected by people in the past, because you want to know what a type specimen is, for example, or you might want to look at the genetic makeup of a plant that was collected a long time ago, so you can compare it to plants in the present. So it's quite a distinctive feature of historical botanical collections, that they do still have that direct relevance in the present to the sciences. They're not just relics of past practice, but there's something that's still being used. And I think that, for me, that's very interesting, because that poses a question of how, as a historian, can you make what you do speak to and serve scientific inquiry today, which is something that I think historians of science have been less and less involved in recent years for various reasons. But it's an interesting question to solve. So there's an awful lot of material left over and remaining in collections. And it poses questions as well about just how do you deal with such a large quantity of material. So all the many thousands of specimens that still remain in collections, something, how do we do the history of that? And that relevance, I think, is very interesting, and it's a nice thing to be involved in.
Any other thoughts?
It raises a question for contemporary science in Australia and in the world, in the way that you were saying, because as soon as Europeans arrived in Australia, they started to cause species to become extinct very, very rapidly indeed. And in Australia now is suffering from the greatest number of extinctions of any country in the world, the very rapid rate. So what Banks's collections do is provide us with a baseline of what was there once, and not only what was there, what it looked like, beautifully illustrated by Parkinson, and the circumstances of exactly where it came from, because the landscape has been utterly transformed. Parts of what were once forest are now desert, or are now being sugarcane plantations and so on. So these are vital baselines for people today trying to determine what existed, what has gone, what has been lost, what can be retrieved, what do we need to kind of honour by resurrecting, if we possibly can, using new techniques. So it's actually a tremendously contemporary issue, and for the world too.
It is. And another really interesting point actually is that it wasn't just the herbarium collections. When Bligh went back the second time after his first failure with Mutiny on the Bounty, he went back with the ship Providence to go and collect the breadfruit. He brought back 1,000 living specimens on his boat, and it came into Dartford. And I understand anyway that Banks went down to the harbour to see this massive greenhouse on the boat, and for him, it was his herbarium come alive. Yeah. So 20 years later, when he didn't bring a single living plant back from his trip. 20 years later, suddenly he was able to see this stuff alive on a boat. Now, interestingly, we equally have a big herbarium collection at Kew. We have 8 million collections in the herbarium, but we also have a very big living collection, obviously in Kew Gardens. And so we started to look at how many of the things that Banks has in his floretium we actually have in our living collection. And we have around, around 71 trees of the tree species that Banks collected. We have around 18 shrubs, but none of the grasses. And that's quite an interesting point. I don't think Banks liked grasses very much, I have to say. There's a fantastic... he collected 2 grasses, as far as I can work out, when he was there on Endeavour. And there's this fantastic quote in one of his journals, which he basically said, one kind of grass which we'd also see that was very troublesome to us. Its sharp seeds were bearded and backwards, and whenever they stuck into our clothes, were by these beards pushed forwards until they got into our flesh. The grass was so plentiful that it was scarcely possible to avoid it, and with the mosquitoes that were likewise innumerable, made walking almost intolerable. And as a result of that, we have very few collections of grasses and the early grass species in Australia. I think it's more to do with the fact they were really uncomfortable environments to be walking through at that point.
It's true. And he also hated them because he brought greyhounds to catch the animals, and he set the greyhounds to chase the kangaroo. And of course, the greyhounds got caught in the grass, and the kangaroos were just going boing, boing, boing. And so, in fact, they had rather pitiful specimens of kangaroos that they got. One very old one that proved inedible, and the other was a baby. So the old kangaroo was able to elude them. And there's another reason he hated grass.
Yeah. Kathy, you were saying to me earlier something about the difference of Banks's legacy in terms of Australian botany and in terms of sort of global influence. I wonder if you could just say something about that.
So Banks's legacy in terms of global influence, he gave us a huge, a massive sort of increase in our knowledge about diversity of plants globally, and it's still incredible. We cannot underestimate that contribution about the different life forms of plants. And also, he was very generous to hand his plants out to many of the nurseries and many private owners across the UK and across Europe. And that was the beginning, in some ways, of these really blousy plants in gardens. Horticulture took off. You know, it was just that era that everyone wanted to have the best, the most beautiful-looking plant. And I don't think you could go to any garden in the world without seeing, if it's warm temperate or subtropical, without seeing a plant that at some point has come from Australia and started with that first trip of Banks's. And I think that's a massive contribution to our, beyond the economic botany stuff. Go the other way to Australia, and we've done the opposite. So the introduction of all these merino sheep, or the Australian merino sheep, the introduction of European crops, the cutting down of trees, huge soil erosion, rivers silting up, all of these things started very, very quickly. And there's a number of articles after the original sort of landing in Botany Bay about how terrible the environment became, because they were very shallow sandy soils, and very, very quickly they got eroded away, and you do start to see extinctions occurring. And you could do some very interesting work to look at what we've now got in all our botanic gardens across the world, which no longer exists in Australia. I think the list would be quite long.
I was thinking about, we've talked a lot about Banks, obviously. I was thinking about the other people that probably need to be mentioned in the story that Banks interacts with, and people who come after him as well. So there are this bunch of people working in Soho Square, among other places, and also we know Banks was a patron to many. So I wonder if we could say something about those. I'd be interested to hear more about your sense of Banks's influence on the generation afterwards. I first came across Banks as the baddie of the story. I was interested in astronomers and mathematicians working in the Royal Society in the 1820s and 30s, the young guns coming in, and they hated Banks and the old guard. They compared his brains very unfavourably with Newton's, so he was not in good stead among some in the 1830s, but clearly he did have an important influence in the future. And I'm also wondering, of course, about the people that Banks met. We know him, in a sense, as a father of ethnography. So he took a real interest, not just in the plants and the species for eating that he came across, but also in really understanding the people that he met. So I wonder if I can invite each of you to say something about other people now and then.
Sure. Well, Banks is something of an enigma because he's not a conventional scientist. He's not an individual who sort of sat down and asked some questions about the natural world and then ingeniously came up with answers to them. So he didn't publish very much, or when he did publish it was in quite obscure journals. And lots of people have said, well, he wasn't a proper scientist. He was just a sort of glorified administrator, or maybe he was good at being a president, but he wasn't so good at other things. And there's a debate about that. But I think one of the things that's coming to light is that if you want to understand Banks, you have to understand his status in society. So Banks is a very, very wealthy individual. And he's also a very, very sort of upper-class aristocratic figure. And in the late 18th century, if you belong to that sort of level of society, then it was quite common to look down upon people who, or at least to not have anything to do with people who worked with their hands. So craftspeople, publishers, and actually experimental scientists, or what were called natural philosophers at the time. So in fact, it may be that Banks thought that experiment and scientific investigations were terrific, but he personally, it would have been inappropriate for him to get his hands dirty doing the actual work. And so what you realise is there's actually a lot of people that Banks employed or was a patron to who did all of this work sort of on his behalf. And once you realise that, you see that there's this whole community of people who are sort of the extended version of Joseph Banks. So one of the papers, so this is hot off the press, one of the papers that we had today, which was absolutely fascinating, was about Humphrey Davy, famous for his miner's safety lamp. And it turns out that Humphrey Davy, who became the president of the Royal Society after Banks, it turns out that Davy was a client of Banks, and that a lot of the agenda of what Davy was interested in doing, and he was working in chemistry, was actually really reflecting Banks's vision of science. So there was we saw a fantastic letter that Banks wrote to Davy when he learned about the miner's safety lamp. He was absolutely ecstatic about it because he thought that it served exactly the kinds of principles that he thought were important in the sciences, which was to show that scientific research, if you put it into an application, could have really practical benefits for humankind. And in the case of the lamp, it would save lives of miners of miners. So I don't think we yet appreciate just how many people were out there serving Banks's agenda or working for him, and so that's to come. And I think when we do that, then we will have a better picture of the broad range of individuals who were involved in what was going on around Banks. And that's just to mention one little part of the story.
You get all of what came next, and we've only got a little time left before we're going to open up to questions.
Okay,
so
well, I'll just say very quickly, I think in three ways you can argue that without Banks there would have been no Darwin. And that is because, first of all, Banks attracted generations of young scientists, not because of his science as much, but because of his image. They read about Banks. Banks was like a kind of a Byron. I mean, he was handsome, he was incredibly sexy in the quite literal sense, and he was adventurous, and he was discovering new worlds and discovering a new kind of extraordinary creation in the southern hemisphere. So this was really intriguing. So that's one way. The second way was he set this example and sponsored it for the rest of his life in the Royal Society of getting the naval expeditions to have a naturalist on board. So you get these great pairings. And it includes all of the young Darwin, the early Darwinists, Hooker, Huxley, not so much Wallace, but and Darwin himself, all went on these naval expeditions with this captain, a close relationship with the captain, exactly modelling themselves, and the captains modelling themselves on the Cook-Banks relationship. So this tradition is what professionalises science in many ways, and also sends them into the southern hemisphere where they find the weirdest and most extraordinary animals. Just think about Darwin looking in a stream and saying, look, that looks exactly like an English water rat, but it turns out to have a duckbill and to lay eggs, the platypus. How on earth is that going on? And this sort of fractured their thinking. It upended their thinking, and it's behind what begins that search for new kinds of origins, breaking with this Linnaean series that you were talking about and beginning the hunt for evolution.
So I can just add very quickly onto that. So wearing a Q hat and the relationship between Banks. So Banks, one of the things he did, he paid people to go and take collections. He professionalised the whole business of collecting. And one of the collectors that he paid was a William Hooker. And of course, William Hooker then went on to become a director of Kew, and then his son came later, Joseph Hooker. So a very strong link between, first of all, paying people, making a paid profession as a collector, then inspired and led to the future of Kew.
And onwards, Hooker becomes president of the Royal Society, Huxley becomes president of the Royal Society, Darwin refused.
And Hooker and Darwin were friends.
Yes.
It's interesting, actually. Banks's legacy seems in many ways to lead to things that he would have hated, like professional science. I mean, that's not the vision he would have had. And likewise, the sort of the impact of the collections now is almost to try and undo, or at least to realise what his legacy has caused. So that's a sort of interesting position to find ourselves in. Thank you very much. There's so much more we could keep on talking about here, I think, but it's time to open up to questions. There is a microphone, if you could wait to have the microphone, and I will start here, then here, then here. So that's 3 questions for the moment.
Hi. Hello. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. My name's Sagar. I've been part of a project which is being funded by the Lottery Fund, and we were doing a short stories project about the East India Company. So some people one guy wrote about the first curry recipe that came out of India to the UK. That was from one of his parents' lofts. My interest was in industrial hemp. And how, when I then learnt about Joseph Banks and the question of hemp, a few years before I learnt about the question of hemp and Joseph Banks, I'd been doing research in this plant for a long time. I'd gone to Kew Gardens. I was surprised to see there was a massive collection of hemp, which is about 3-4 years ago. I just caught the last day of it. And then in the last 10 years, I've got friends all across from the US to Australia, and they're telling me the issues with droughts in one part of Australia. Now, my question is, 200 years ago, when Mr. Banks was sent all over the world to Australia, primarily to find where the best sources of hemp were, not to just send people from the UK, and also India, where he did go to try and get hemp, but he actually ended up getting stoned on cannabis because he actually got confused between the two plants. But I think you'll also probably enjoyed it as well. My question was, 200 years later, with the serious issues you've got in the southern hemisphere with regards to water droughts, and the huge amount of knowledge that you've got between Kew Gardens and Calcutta Botanical, which you guys had a partnership with for a long time, for climate change, I see a lot of research going on around the world with regards to the environmental benefits of this plant, which I think was the toughest plant for Banks to deal with. What is Kew Gardens or its partners in Australia or India or the US doing to actually, further the research that I'm sure Banks would have probably revelled in doing 200 years later? And also, incidentally, what would have the British Empire been if there was no sails or no ropes or no clothing for the Navy? Would it have just been a very big towboat? So my question is, for climate change, are we furthering his research, and are we actually making use of the great people that were there doing the research to actually further advance the benefits for climate change and so on and so on? Thank you.
I think that's a really good question, and I can't speak directly for hemp because we're not currently working on that. But I think we do use the same approach, and let me give you one example, which is crop wild relatives. So crop wild relatives are the sort of the sisters, the ancestors of many of our crops, and you tend to find them in the Fertile Crescent. You find them all over the world. Now these things tend to be small and a bit weedy looking, and you think, you know, you would not automatically conserve them. Yet many of those crop wild relatives contain the genes that these have been through multiple climate changes, and they're more resilient to climatic perturbations. So we, in the Millennium Seed Bank, we've been collecting the seeds. We've got 20% currently of the world's crop wild relatives. And we're working on those plants to start to find where are those resilient genes, and then breeding them back into the crops. And it's the same approach. It's going back into the wild to find the original plants, as it were, and starting to look at those and realise that they do contain the resilience, and often, you know, they are our future. But hemp is a really interesting one to look at. We're not working on that presently, but should look at it.
Any other comments on that one? Not for the moment. We have some others. Lady in the second row there.
Hello. I'd just like also to make a case for Banks's other London home and its role in the production of scientific knowledge. So I'm talking about Spring Grove House, which is not too far from Kew. And, you know, I think that was the estate he acquired, and it was because of that proximity to Kew that he was able to spend so much time at Kew working under George III. It's also where he did some of his crop experiments, agricultural experiments, which he was not able to do, of course, really in Soho Square. The merino sheep were first there at Spring Grove, and he also had an early glass house, in which he was trying to propagate tropical plants. So I just felt that to some extent it was getting a little bit eclipsed by Soho Square, but also played a key role in the production of scientific knowledge. And I don't have shares in the place, but I would like to say that it's participating this weekend in open house. So if anyone's going over to Kew, it's a fairly short journey certainly by car, about 10 minutes on from Kew, and well worth a look.
There's also estates in Lincolnshire as well, aren't there? So all of these different domestic or more agricultural settings, as well as the globe, were his sort of, I don't know if you have any comments.
Right. Well, I totally agree. As I said, I only got time to talk about little bits, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really crucial part of Banks's story. It's another part of the story that's perhaps relatively understudied. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, Banks is a very wealthy gentleman. He's got estates, houses. He's working in multiple areas, in multiple parts of the country, in different kinds of property. And I think it's interesting how he sort of compartmentalizes those places for different kinds of work and different kinds of life. So his estate at Revesby is not so experimental maybe compared to some of the other places. Yeah, that's just one more facet of it that really needs to be explored. But again, I mean, coming to those particular experiments you were talking about, I think they tie into this question about his interest in chemistry, because I think he works with a chemist on part of that plant, the experiments on plants.
Gentleman in the front row here, and then.
Thanks for an interesting discussion. Thanks for my first breadfruit. I remember in Patrick O'Brien's excellent biography, there was a quotation. I don't have it here, but Banks encountered the breadfruit in Tahiti, and he wanted bread just grows on trees, and because they don't have to the Tahitians don't have to till the soil, plant the grain, harvest the grain, thresh the grain, grind the grain, bake the bread. They have all this time for sex. And my question to you, serious, why don't we have it in our supermarkets?
Any comments?
Well, it's an interesting one. The breadfruit, they didn't actually like it that much, the British sailors. And they also had some problems with the slaves, actually, even getting adapted to breadfruit. So it's an acquired taste. I think the sex went on irrespective of the breadfruit.
Moving on from this subject to one of the younger members of the audience before we go any further. Your question.
Do you think Banks would approve if he knew that some of the plants he collected were used with genetic engineering?
I think given what I was saying earlier, that the basic idea with Banks is that that nature is there to improve and to serve human help, to help humans. I think genetic engineering is something that it follows in that line of thought. So I would say that if Banks knew about it, he possibly would have approved. I mean, I think if he'd known about the environmental consequences of what he sort of helped to set in motion, that might have been something that would have been pretty hard to deal with. But I think the basic idea of using what he would have called art, what we would call technology, to enhance nature by understanding it and then using that understanding to change it, I think would have been something he would be sympathetic with.
Yeah, we're in agreement. There's one here, and then there's a hand near the back.
Thank you. One question in relation to Banks is, in what sense was he a scientist in an intellectual sense, certainly in a modern intellectual sense? By that I mean, to what extent was he ever interested in attempting to go beyond simply collection and categorization and to describe process and then to explain it? Despite the fact he had contact with Erasmus Darwin, who produced a theory of evolution, as far as I'm aware, there is no evidence that Banks ever commented on the theory of evolution, let alone causation, including selection, which means that Banks had no consideration of inheritance or selection more widely. So for a general audience, perhaps we could just develop this question in terms of, should we really consider him to be a scientist in this intellectual sense?
I should say first that the word scientist was not coined until after Banks's death, so that question presupposes an awful lot of things about what we assume science is, but I think there's some interesting things to discuss. I don't know if you want to...
He was more experimental and more theoretical than he might appear. I mean, he was primarily a collector, and in that sense biodiversity was an issue to him. But also, of course, he was testing it against the theory that Simon has outlined, really, that there is a chain of being with every single link that goes from the tiniest planarian worm up to angels. And that was the ruling idea. And so was the ruling idea, the fixity of species and a single point of creation. And he did, in some ways, jolt that theory by himself speculating whether there was an alternative creation in Australia. And it means that there's a slight shift in the theory of creation as partly as a result of Banks and Cook coming back with all this stuff that just doesn't fit. So what you get by the time Darwin sets off, the creationists have got a slightly varied idea, which is that there were multiple sites of creation, and that in each of those sites were chosen so that the species could be designed to suit the environments there. So you've had a bit of a shift. And the other thing I would say is that he did, and just one example of an interesting experiment. They saw some what he called to be seawater sawdust in the water around the reefs, and they didn't know what it was, so they collected it. And they tried to work out what it was. They put it under a microscope. It seemed to be alive. They burnt it, but it didn't smell like an animal. What it was, we now know, was planktonic marine bacteria, cyanobacteria, which is being used by scientists now in order to put nitrogen back into the water to enable corals to flourish. So that little experiment has come back to roost many, many years later. I agree with you, he's not a theoretical scientist in his, in the forefront of his thinking, but it's there in an implicit way, and especially if you think about the theories of the day rather than evolution, which is, of course, quite a lot later.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I was just thinking about that. But I was also thinking in Banks's time, every time they went somewhere, everything they were seeing was absolutely new. So, and the amount of time, I mean, I know from some of the people who work in the herbarium at Kew, the amount of time it takes to collect one good specimen in the field, to get it pressed, to draw it, to make sure you've catalogued it correctly. And that's with all the modern day technology we have. So in a sense, I don't think, it's a different way of doing science. There are all these different parts and requirements of science, and that fundamental working out what is there is also a scientific endeavour, but it's a very different one to the one which is working out mechanism process. But I still think there's space for both, and we still have teams of scientists, for example, going out to Colombia right now, where changing the political situation, there's a whole areas of the Colombian rainforest that have never had anyone going in there seeing what the plants are. And they will be going in there doing exactly what Banks did when he first arrived in Australia. So it's a really interesting question, that one. I should think about it further.
I think this is going to have to be our last question because time is marching on. But thank you.
Good evening. Yes, my daughter and I were researching the origin of the name Pimlico last night, and we saw that it came from the 17th century. It was a puffin-like seabird from the Eastern Caribbean, East Indies, and we were wondering if it was largely these explorers like Banks and Darwin who were responsible for the scientific lexicons of botanical and zoological nomenclature and terms that we use today for the plants and animals. Were they the ones that came up with it?
There's a lot of Banksia out there of various sorts, but yeah.
Well, some of them definitely. I mean, some of them have changed over time, and some have remained the same. And sorting out actually all of that is quite a complicated, a huge task. But just before, so Banks is working at the end of the 18th century. It's really the early to mid 18th century when people like Linnaeus said there are so many different names, even scientific names for species, that we need to have some kind of systematic way of organising them all. So Linnaeus came up with the binomial nomenclature that we still use today. So just before Banks, there'd been a sort of big effort to try and systematise things. So that set in place a lot of names that have remained up to the present. But the criteria for naming change over time, and so the names change. So it's a sort of mixture of things. I didn't know about the Pimlico though. That's fascinating.
Okay, I think we should draw it to conclusion now. I'm sure there are more questions, but we will have to finish up here. If I could ask you, before asking you to join me in thanking the panel, if I could ask you to fill in the feedback forms that are left on your seats. The Royal Society would be very grateful. I'm sure the participants would be grateful too to know that you've enjoyed this evening. But if you can join me in thanking the discussants this evening.